And so as a vehicle taken from the daily lives or leisure days, as the case may be, of some Canadians, the canoe is commandeered as a sign of Canadian subjectivity, where it authorizes a specific performance of identity. While it includes an acceptance of diversity, pairing well with the aims of a multicultural policy, the canoe also inhabits a very linear history of the state, finding the originary event of Canada in the encounter between Europeans and the vast, already Canadian wilderness. The canoe as a national vehicle is a tale that is constantly retold, and particularly in light of its relationship to colonialism, it's a story that always holds a significant amount of anxiety over its difference and over its, accuracy. And it seems to me that historical reenactments like Donaldson's exist in relationship to this anxiety of the nation. Think of his justification for the trip, the death of Canadian history. To counter this anxiety, reenactments present a founding narrative of Canada through the voyageurs and fur trade explorers, and then attempt to embody this narrative in the canoe trip itself, right? They try to actually sort of weave together that pedagogical narrative in our actual performances of canoeing, so that we've kind of sort of tried to at least sublimate that anxiety into something that maybe is just personal for us and not for the nation. And this is, I think, actually fairly interesting in the way we tell history through the canoe. And so the voyageurs represent the pedagogical narrative of the nation, but through the encounters with the canoe, the reenactments attempt to reify this narrative. And I'm going to return to this question of embodying history in a little bit, but first I want to kind of show that pedagogical story as it comes out of these enactments and turning back again to Donaldson's story. So following Mackenzie, Donaldson starts out in 1990 on the upper end of the rapids of Lachine, just west of downtown Montreal. He soon passes the chapel at St. Anne where, quote, he says, voyageurs would leave an offering to the priest to gain protection of the good St. Anne along the wild rivers leading to the savage interior. Yet despite his commitment to Canadian history, we quickly find that there is a certain story of Canada that Donaldson does not want to tell. Specifically, he encounters history in the making in the form of the Kanesatake standoff. There we go. As he paddles by Sûreté de Quebec officers spreading razor wire along the river, Donaldson concludes his few brief words on the conflict by saying an ugly situation was unfolding in a tense confrontation between First Nations people and Canada. The fracas created a deep rift that will take generations to heal. So, of course, the Kanesatake standoff and the Oka crisis is a confrontation between a municipal government that wanted to create a condo and golf course over land that the Kanesatake Mohawks considered sacred, this area called the Pines. And if we actually take a little bit of a look back at the history of the Pines, we can see that the conflict over the Pines at Kanesatake was not invented by the Mohawk warriors in 1990, right? That this conflict over the Pines is actually intimately tied to the industry that propelled Mackenzie further and further into the continent. For it was the Mohawk and Oka that were making canoes for the fur trade, and they were also supplying many of the paddlers for the voyageur canoes themselves. So they were, in fact, many of the voyageurs in the 18th century. The Pines, the land at the center of the Oka crisis, was part of the treaty between New France and the Kanesatake Mohawks that allowed them to stay there and be a part of this industry. So now this seems to me to be an example of depoliticization. And if we want to follow Wendy Brown here, she writes that depoliticization involves removing a political phenomenon from the comprehension of its historical emergence and from a recognition of the powers that produce and contour it. And Donaldson's brief remarks on Oka happen to involve both levels of abstraction here. An abstraction of the history of Oka as a fur trade community and an abstraction of the Iroquois Canada-Quebec relationships. When the history and the relations of power are obscured, the political phenomenon, claims Brown, is embodied with an ontological naturalness, a sort of naturalization of it as if it will always exist. And we are left often with no approach to reconsider the situation. When this ontological naturalness is assumed for the nation, we can see that the pedagogical story has kind of done its job. We assume that it's there in its originary event. And Oka, in Donaldson's narrative, is a natural outcome of difference, which, while unfortunate, is a regular part of each generation of the nation. That is, will constantly kind of interact with this difference and this problem because that's just the nation and that's just what it's going to be. So the canoe provides a particularly powerful vehicle, I think, for the triumph of the pedagogical narrative because it is performative as well. Participants experience both historical and contemporary spheres of the nation when they go canoeing in this way. Beyond simply ignoring historical circumstance, as Donaldson and in fact others do, the reenactments also personalize the experiences of the nation onto the body of the canoeist. For many, this experience is an experience of the nation because the canoe can act as a conduit for the landscape, particularly in the necessity, when traveling by canoe, to have a direct and often intimate contact with nature. As Pierre Elliott Trudeau once wrote, what sets a canoeing expedition apart is that it purifies you more rapidly and inescapably than any other. Travel 1,000 miles by a train and you are a brute. Pedal 500 miles on a bicycle and you are basically a bourgeois. Paddle 100 miles in a canoe and you are already a child of nature. When nature stands in for the nation, this intimacy is a fertile ground for experiencing that pedagogical story of the nation. Trudeau once again guides us in this area. I know a man whose school could never teach him in patriotism, but who acquired this virtue when he felt it in his bones, the vastness of his land, and the greatness of those who founded it. So now let's think about colonial history in this circumstance. In this relationship of intimacy, the problems of Canadian history, problems of colonialism, regionalism, resource dependence, gender inequality, are all diffused through stories of individuals operating in specific circumstances. For example, the canoe historian John Jennings describes the value of the canoe to the character of Canada and the Canadian nation through its ability to force individuals to accommodate each other in the close quarters of the canoe. Forced intimacy is the phrase Jennings uses to describe the relationship between French and Indigenous groups in the 17th and 18th century that was mediated through the canoe. That is essentially paddling a canoe together, you have to be friends. That's his thesis. The rivers, lakes, and forests, importantly, of the northern half of North America were such that Europeans needed to rely upon indigenous technologies not only to travel through, as in the case of the canoe, but also to survive, especially in winter. And so for Jennings, this documents a significant shift in the relationship between Old World and New. So in order to explore the New World, the French, like Samuel de Champlain and his cadre of interpreters and missionaries, had to travel, in fact, side by side with Algonquin and Huron paddlers. And Jennings writes that here, cultural barriers broke down, especially when Native women accompanied white traders and voyageurs as wives or companions. So in order to colonize Canada, implies Jennings, Europeans had to get intimate with both land and its inhabitants, thus changing the character of such colonization. Now, he doesn't take any interest in the kind of gender dynamics of this relationship that's going on here, but clearly it's important because if we think about this term forced intimacy, we are often led to think about sexual violence, but in fact, it's important to note that Jennings, in describing the intimate relationships between European men and Indigenous women as this matter of forced intimacy, was not at all referring to sexual violence, despite the fact of such violent encounters on the historical record, right? So this is a part that does not get considered. In fact, it's just a tool of good relationships. So for Jennings, Samuel de Champlain, in fact, plays an important role in the development of his idea of forced intimacy. It was Champlain, for him, who realized that canoes would be useful for getting the geographic knowledge that he so desired. After failing to pass the rapids at Lachine on the St. Lawrence, Champlain writes in his diary, "It is vain to imagine that a man is able to pass the said rapids with any boats of ours. But he that would pass them must fit himself with the canoes of the savages, which one may easily carry." This indeed becomes the success in the New World, and directing himself by means of the said savages and the canoes, a man, Champlain continues, may see all that is to be seen, good and bad, within, the space of a year or two. Geographic imagination's a little overzealous there.